Hip thrust is one of the most popular exercises for building that perfectly shaped glutes. But is it really the best exercise for targeting these muscles? Or can you get similar or even better results with more conventional and functional exercises? So I dove into the latest research on this topic to find out what science says. The latest and most extensive research I found on this topic is this 2023 study from Plotkin and colleagues at Auburn University. This study compared hip thrust to back squat training for 9 weeks in 34 untrained university-age men and women. It addressed a lot of questions of interest by not only comparing hip thrust against squats for the impact on glute hypertrophy, but also in seeing whether acute baseline EMG glute measurements predicted hypertrophy. On top of that, they also compared the strength transfers of hip thrust and squats to deadlifts. The main finding was that hip thrust and squats produce similar hypertrophy in all 4 glute regions assessed. In addition, the quads and adductors grew more following squats, while the hamstrings did not meaningfully hypertrophy. Thus, it appears that both exercises are similarly effective at growing the glute max, neither is effective at growing the hamstrings or glute medius or minimus, and the squat is better for both growing the adductors and quadriceps. Most of this is unsurprising with an understanding of functional anatomy. For example, along with the glutes, despite its name, the adductor magnus is a principal hip extensor. The glutes and adductors are the 2 largest hip extensors, and both have strong moment arms for hip extension. But unlike the glutes, the hip extensor moment of the adductor increases as hip flexion increases. This is what happens on the eccentric phase of a squat, which is then likely part of the reason why deeper squats produce more adductor hypertrophy than shallower squats. Thus, given that subjects in the squat group achieved a reasonably deep position where the femurs were parallel to the floor, and considering that hip thrust involves less hip flexion than sufficiently deep squats, greater adductor growth in the squat group makes sense. Likewise, it makes sense that quadriceps growth favored squats, as they involve far more knee flexion than hip thrust, and it also makes sense that the biarticular hamstrings did not grow in response to squats. The most interesting hypertrophy finding, in my opinion, is just how targeted the hip thrust appears to be for glute hypertrophy, very much in line with what machines like the Bootey Builder, etc. are claiming. Moving on to the strength data, quite unsurprisingly, squat 3 rep max increased more in the squat group, and hip thrust 3RM increased more in the hip thrust group, and both had similar transfer to a deadlift 3RM and the wall push. The strength data is actually quite interesting, as depending on whether you take a movement-centric view or a muscle-centric view of strength, you might expect different outcomes. For example, both the deadlift and squat are multi-joint lifts performed with free weights, where you stand on the ground and produce vertical force through the combined actions of hip and knee extension. Certainly, the deadlift is more hip extension dominant, and the squat is more knee extension dominant, but they have a lot of kinematic overlap. So someone thinking about transfer from a movement-centric lens would predict better deadlift improvements from squatting. On the other hand, during the hip thrust, you are partially lying down with your back on a bench, isolating hip extension while producing horizontal force. It's a very different movement. But from a muscle-centric perspective, you might argue the hip thrust would produce better strength transfer, as you're specifically targeting the hip extensors, the prime movers in a deadlift. The final point of discussion is what you should not conclude from this study. I've seen people say that this study shows that the glutes, unlike other muscles, don't grow better when trained at longer muscle lengths. The rationale behind such a conclusion is that the squat trains the glutes at a longer muscle length than the hip thrust, yet both resulted in similar glute hypertrophy. The problem with this conclusion is that this study did not isolate muscle length as the independent variable. The independent variable was the choice of exercise. And hip thrusts and squats differ in many ways, not just the length at which they train the glutes. If one actually wanted to determine if the glutes responded better to being trained at longer or shorter relative muscle lengths, you'd have to compare the same exercise performed at different muscle lengths. Fortunately, that data exists. In this study, Kubo and colleagues compared half squats, which train the glutes at a shorter length, to deep squats, which train the glutes at a longer length, and reported that deep squats produce significantly more glutes and adductor hypertrophy. I think it's fair to say that the hip thrust has its place in the gym, not only because it's effective for glute hypertrophy, but also because it has some other benefits. It requires less technical expertise than the squats. It doesn't load the spine, it avoids hypertrophy in the hamstrings, and it produces minimal hypertrophy in the adductors